How's it going? First thing is, I've been offline, not offline, but I haven't been on any of the chat groups for about a little over a week. Had a friend out here who I'm trying to help out. She's looking to move out here, and somebody I'm very tight with. So I spent a lot of time with her. Didn't give me a lot of time to do anything like this, but I appreciate people reaching out. That was really awesome. Thank you. And I've been really looking forward to having another conversation with anybody, 300, Byron, whoever. I would love to talk some more. I really loved the last conversation, and I'm looking to have a lot more of those. I've been saying for a long time, waiting for the government to fix things or waiting for big groups of people to make decisions for us is a stupid thing to do. We've got rights, and we're individuals, and we should be able to at least talk to each other. We're not going to solve the world's problems, but maybe we'll solve a couple of our own. So I'm looking forward to doing that real soon. Um, One of the things that I really thought about is getting into some of these conversations about things that are going on between black and white or whatever. And I thought it would be important, if you didn't mind, for me to go back, at least speaking for my generation, the people that grew up the way I did, about a couple of things, that the challenges that we have to deal with before we even start talking. And maybe it'll help a little bit. This is, first of all, I want to say this. I'm going to say this probably 10 times. There's no excuse for blatant bigotry. There's no excuse. Nobody has the right to be shitty to somebody because they think they're whatever and the other person's whatever. Nobody has a right to do that. But to not acknowledge that there's things that we all have to deal with before we even start talking that are part of what we've had to deal with growing up, I don't think that would be right. I think it would be important to at least, open that up a little bit and talk about that. So this isn't about an opinion or anything, or saying we should think this or we should think that. All I want to do is, as a guy like me, some of the things that we've had to deal with before we even get to having a conversation about anything. Hold on. I'm just turning the ears down. So, people say, about being white or whatever. First of all, there are a lot of differences. Myself personally, I just turned 56. A 56-year-old white guy, and I'll talk about that in a second. Growing up in New Jersey, as opposed to, say, a 75-year-old white dude that lives in Idaho or Wyoming, as opposed to the 20-year-old white kid in Boston, or the 30-year-old white person in Florida down near Miami. I mean, culturally, there's so many differences. So to even use the word white, I can't speak for white people. I mean, there's no way I could do that, especially being an individualist, somebody that believes that our character and our faith and our morality stops all of that other stuff from coming up if we allow it to, and we make choices, good choices, based on what we are and who we've learned, or who we are and what we've learned. I'm sorry. So, I'm going to try and speak generally about people who are the descendants of immigrants from about 100 years ago, my grandparents. Okay, I think I can speak kind of generally about them, whose families came through New York City, Ellis Island, for those 70, 80 years it was open, whatever it was. And I think I can generally speak about them. And I think we have three specific challenges before we even start talking about anything that I'd like to talk about and let people know. This is something. Like I'm saying, once again, it doesn't forgive anybody for being shitty to anybody or being mean to anybody, or to have that hatred. But it's still something that we have to work through before we even get down and sit down and say, hi, I'm Joe, you're whoever. So here it is. And I got some notes here. Number one, like I've just said, my grandparents and a lot of the people that grew up around me, when I say around me, within around 20, 30 miles of New York City, if you grew up in the 60s and 70s, your grandparents, at least, if not your parents, were immigrants from Europe. Now, my father's side, they're Italian. And he came over. My grandfather came over in around World War One. They wanted to get away from what was going on in Europe in World War One, which was fucking horrific. World War One is the worst. I'm a bit of a history buff. I love history, and this is why one of the things that people get confused with this whole white thing. When you're coming over from Italy in 1920, you're not white. You're Italian, okay? Or if, you're Irish, or you're Scottish, or you're Polish, or you're Spanish, or you're German. That was your primary identification. And there was a lot of challenges with people within those other groups from Europe that they brought with them that had been there for hundreds of years. I mean, European history is insane. And they brought those with them. One of the funny things I think about is the Irish specifically, or a lot of Irish people in my area that I grew up in. You had the Irish that came over real early, like in the early 1800s, and then you had the next wave of Irish people in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, when the war's going on. The people that were already here that were Irish, they called themselves natives, they hated the new Irish people that came in. I mean, they were both Irish, but they hated them. It was just this insane hatred. There was a movie about it, Gangs of New York, right? What's his name? Daniel Day-Lewis, or whatever his name is. There was a lot of bigotry in my grandfather's generation because it was real. You moved into a neighborhood with other Italians. You moved into a neighborhood with other Irish, Scottish, whatever you were. And because there were all those challenges. Forget about being black or Puerto Rican. I mean, or Hispanic or Cuban. I mean, forget about that. That wasn't even part of the conversation. So they passed that down to their kids who grew up during the Depression in the 30s and 40s. The 30s. Excuse me. You have all of that hatred passed down to you, and all these. Well, it's more fear than it is hatred. And you're growing up in a world, and now you're raising kids in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. If you know anybody that's in their 50s and 60s, they'll tell you what the Vietnam era was like and how crazy it was. And trying to adjust to that world too. It's really hard for a person who's raised in a lot of hatred and then has kids to not pass some sort of belief in your own first. Can you relate to that at all? I mean, I don't know if you can or you can't. I'm just saying, you're raised by people who went through this whirlwind. They went through World War One, the Depression, World War Two, all of this craziness, and then they go through Vietnam trying to raise kids as people in their 30s, trying to raise kids in this crazy time where there's all these new boundaries being broken. If you're a kid, that's going to get passed down to you. I'm not saying that the hatreds get passed down to you, but you see it. All right? You see it. Your character should allow you later on to grow past that. But it's still part of who you are as a kid. When you were a kid, were there things that your elders taught you, your parents, your uncles, your aunts, whoever they were, I don't know who they are, that they said, do this, believe this, believe that. I know mine did. So that's the first challenge. If you grew up in that general area and you're in my age group, you're dealing with two generations of a lot of interracial. And when I say interracial, like I said, Scottish, Irish, Spanish, Italian, Jewish. I mean, there was a lot of that. It had nothing to do with black. Black had nothing to do with it. You were still dealing with that whole thing. And then, the black, Puerto Rican, whatever, that becomes part of it as well. That's the first part. You're talking about the bigotry of those eras being passed down to people my age. That's number one. Number two, American history was taught so badly when I was a kid. It was taught really, really bad to the point where you now have to have a Black History Month, which I get. I totally get it. They're not teaching it properly in schools when I'm growing up. Now, I'm growing up in the 70s. We're not learning what we're supposed to learn. We have history books that were written well before the social revolution. They were written during World War II, right after World War II. So everybody's got this patriotic USA thing going on. They didn't want to talk about the struggles. They taught history. I don't know how you learned history. I learned history's dates and people. July 4th, 1776, a bunch of people signed the Declaration of Independence. Okay, what the fuck do I care? What does that have to do with me? Why? What was going on? What was going on that created that? They didn't teach that. They didn't teach history the way it needed to be taught. And you're talking about history, like when I was in high school, you had to have 1 year of it. You had to have 4 years of English, 4 years of math, 4 years of gym. But you were only required to have 1 year of history. So what are you going to learn in 1 year in high school when you're supposed to be smart enough now to work this out? You're not going to learn anything. You're going to learn a bunch of dates and a bunch of numbers, and then you're going to learn nonsense like the Civil War. We have the North and we have the South, and all the people that hated slavery were in the North, and all the people that really loved it were in the South. That's a bunch of bullshit. When you really dig into the history back then, you realize it was way, way crazier than that. That there were plenty of people in the South that despised slavery, and there were plenty of people in the North that didn't want to fight for it at all. It was just this crazy time, and it's so deep. So we weren't taught history the way it needed to be taught, and we didn't learn about people that we should have learned about, that we all should learn about. There was one cat in particular. I mean, I could talk about 100 people. There's one guy in particular that I want to mention. His name was Peter Salem. Now, Peter Salem was a slave in 1775. He's relieved from being a slave temporarily to fight for the Union, or not the Union, the Revolution, the Continentals. Well, there's this battle, right, in Bunker Hill in Massachusetts. And the Continentals, the army that he was a part of, was about to get completely demolished, get just wiped off the map. He manages to shoot the lieutenant in charge of the British army that's advancing. And when he does that, it sort of sends the British people in the army in a bit of a disarray. They don't know who to follow. That gives the Continentals a chance to retreat and reset. If Peter Salem doesn't shoot that lieutenant, the Continental Army is wiped out, and there's a good chance the revolution ends. Here's a black man who shoots a British dude who literally, with one shot, gives the Continentals a chance to regroup and the war can continue, which we eventually win. I didn't learn about him till recently. I mean, I had to go out there and learn this myself. Why aren't we being taught this? And this is a guy like him, the stature he should have in our histories, I think is pretty high. Somebody that does something like that, why don't I know about these things? Another guy, Hiram Revels, the first black senator in American history, 1870. He was a Republican. I mean, he was a Republican. Why didn't I learn about his history? Why didn't I learn about what he did? He learned to be a preacher, and he traveled. Part of his life was in Indiana. I live in Indiana now. I didn't learn these things. You know what I learned? Oh, the Civil War ended slavery. All right. What does that mean? That's. I want to learn more about this. I want to know more about this. Our history was taught poorly. When I say our history, it's black history. Black history is part of American history. And when they didn't teach it properly for so long, I get why people get pissed off. And then there's another answer to that. There's another aspect of that. You got to remember, when I'm growing up in the early 70s, Malcolm X is still alive. And the media portrayed him in a really bad light where I lived. He was a militant. And you know what that means, right? Well, when you're 9 years old, you can't figure this shit out for yourself. Now, 20 years later, I started learning about who he was and the impact he had on the black community and how essential he was. Well, why aren't we learning this stuff? It's crazy. And that's the second part of this. History. The history of black people in this country as part of this country is not taught properly. At least it wasn't taught properly. I'm speaking for people in my age group. All right? It wasn't taught properly. That's number two. And then number three, something I've said before. The news media has no interest in reporting news. All they want to do is profit from hate. I'm not going to dig into that too much. I think it's pretty obvious now. People are seeing it. So now, here we are. Here I am to try and start a conversation with good people who I've gotten to know over the last couple of years, Byron specifically. Your family history teaches you, number one, your family history is just bent with bigotry over a couple of generations, but most of it towards other white people. You're not taught history correctly, and the media is doing everything they can to make sure that we don't do what we're doing right now. That's a tough place to start a conversation. The analogy I came up with is like, all right, I want you to build a house. You don't get any wood. All right, that's the first thing. Second thing is, I know you don't know how to build it, but I'm not going to give you any of the directions or any of the plans. Oh, and number three, there's going to come some people. They're going to come over and knock over whatever you start. Kind of hard to build a house like that, right? I mean, and that's what we're dealing with right now. I'm not making excuses for people who make a choice to be shitty to other people. I'm not doing that. All I'm saying is that it's a tough conversation to start because of all of these things, and probably other things as well. There's some shame, too, that comes into all of this that I don't even want to get into. This is enough to talk about. So if you were kind enough to listen to this, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to talking to other people, and I'm looking forward to hearing if there's any similarity in what you dealt with in your childhood. Were you taught not to do certain things? I've heard, and I can say this, I've heard from enough of my friends that were black that they've told me, look, I was taught vote Democrat because the other people are racists. If you have enough people teaching you that over 30 years, I mean, you're not going to vote for the other team. I'm not saying you should vote for the other team. That's not my place. I'm not telling you to. I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do. I'm saying that that's something. Think about that if you've dealt with that. And now think about when I'm growing up as a kid and you're living during the Vietnam era with people that have just absorbed a ton of hatred because of their own race, which happens to be white but not white because you're Italian or you're Irish or you're Polish or you're whatever. And you're not learning history the way you need to learn it. And you've got a media that wants nothing to do with making sure you and me talk. It's pretty friggin' hard. But I want to try. I'm doing my best. I mean, I have a heart to love other people, and I have a Facebook history going back 13 years. So if you want to check it out, check it out. You'll see who I am. I got nothing to hide, and I'm not a liberal. And I'm going to leave it with that. Believe me when I tell you. Please, at least open yourself up to the possibility that there are a lot of people that are white who are asking the same questions. I'm not speaking for anybody. Please look for yourself. But we're being told you have to have a very, very small view of the world if you want to fit in. And it's not a good view. So, man, I hope this made sense. I just want to do what I can. All right? So to everybody that's part of this group, thank you if you listen to this. And I wish you all the very best. Talk to you soon.